The Creole Amharic language of settler-colonial is not merely bilingualism, but weapon of ethnocides. Language is a unique tool that human beings invented, developed, evolved, and fine-tuned to communicate the fruit of their history with their own fellow species. It is the sum of the whole that identifies their cultural, mental, spiritual, socio-political, economic, and physiological phenomenon of all people rests up on it, and their place in this blue planet. Language is the alpha and the omega of human civilizations. As the software functions in computer, so does language in human interactions and human civilizations. A computer hardware without software is non-functional or is an assemblage metal gadgets, so does human without language and culture is nothing but a bipedal creature. That is why it is essential to bear in mind that all colonialists waged wars on language, culture, and history. All in one to wipe out the indigenousness and come to conclude as the people without history. Settler-colonial language is not merely bilingualism, but a silent killer, a tool of ethnocides. As genuine scholars unanimously argue that no greater injustice can be committed against a people than to deprive them of their own language. Since the arrival of the nomadic southwestern Arabian tribes who prefer to call themselves Habeshas, they waged cataclysmic wars of wipe out of the indigenous cultures, i.e., languages, rituals, customs, and values, to erase their history from their memory and supplant with their exported myth, legends, and 𝗘𝗁𝗃𝗀𝗃 folklore as history. 𝗟RH of Hebrew myth of Byzantine Empire, a rescue tool for Habeshas. They attempted to supplant with third-hand imported and adopted Hebrew myth of Byzantine Empire as a rescue and invasion tool. Once they consolidate and control political power under their clans' warlords and outlaws, they began committing cultural genocides on the people of northeastern Africas, within whom they settled and found home. They deployed what was called the Amharic language, a Creole and the youngest to 𝗔𝗺𝗵 and 𝗔𝗺𝗃 language, which were considered the direct descendant of 𝗔𝗰𝗄𝗃. What was called 𝗔𝗰𝗄𝗃 by itself is again a pidgin language. It was thought to be spoken between 400 and 900 AD in 𝗔𝗺𝗃𝗀𝗃 and spread during the warlord and the outlaw chieftains named 𝗔𝗯𝘆𝗀𝗃, told who was converted to the Greek version of Christianity of the Byzantine Empire, used it as the major tool of conquest, occupy, evict the indigenous folks of Cushitic family of the region, like the 𝗔𝗺, the 𝗵𝗂, the 𝗂, Oromo, etc. The assertion that the Amharic language, particularly within the context of the 𝗪𝗃𝗁, settler-colonial project, functioned as a weapon of ethnocide, and far from being a neutral medium of communication, since it was systematically enforced as the sole official language of the settlers, it was the major tools of indoctrination, next to imported guns, since the era of the semi-feudal serfdom despotic rule of 𝗪𝗴. It was a tool of marginalization, suppression, and eventual erosion of countless indigenous African languages across regions subjected to imperial expansion, such as the Oromo language and other languages of Cushitic, Nilotic, and Omotic languages, i.e. 𝗁90 indigenous languages incarcerated within the empire. It was not about fostering genuine bilingualism or linguistic diversity, but rather about enforced assimilation and the destruction of distinct cultural identities. Tamiz characterized this history as merely promoting bilingualism, fundamentally ignores the coercive power dynamics and the profound trauma inflicted upon communities whose languages, oral traditions, and unique worldviews were systematically undermined, suppressed, and effectively contributing to the ethnocide of diverse peoples under the guise of national unity or progress. A slogan of series of fascist pariah dictators to the very date, and the role of the church and their detrives, illiterate, arrogant, chauvinist priests, to wash their hand in it, and that holds true to the very date. The Peri departs from their Creole settlers' language Guiez crowned it as lingua sacra, used during the rule of the tyrant warlord called 𝗔𝗯𝘆𝗀𝗃 without a shame. That must be called lingua 𝗂𝗃𝗻 nostrum, the language of divers and invaders. He committed genocides and ethnocides, cultural genocides, for about 3 decades of tyranny and spread in his empire known as the Aksum Empire. The fact is, 𝗔𝗯𝘆𝘀𝗀𝗶𝗃 by itself is pidgin language, whose substratum was a gathering of all native languages of Cushitic families like Aju, Bija, Saho, Oromo, etc., and Greek and Southwest Arabian languages called Semitic, known as lingua franca at that specific period of time and place. The utility of Amharic as a full-fledged tool is indeed a very recent phenomena out of Habeshas proper, a post so-called 𝗪𝗵𝗵𝗿 messiphant, translated as the era of princess, a misnomer by itself that must be called the era of butcherers, or most priceless the era of chieftainship. Anarchy and chaos, butchery of two deep-rooted rival groups of 𝗔𝗺𝗵𝗿 Aksum in the north and 𝗔𝗯𝘆𝘀𝗀𝗏 the south within Habeshas proper. It was known that 𝗂𝗂, from Korah Amhara, who crowned himself as 𝗬𝗏𝘁𝗁𝗏 II, 1855-1868, after wiping out all his rivals at the region. He was known as a cannibalist by the Oromo people, enjoy spilling blood like carnivore. His brute, subhuman behavior, who chopped heads, hands, and legs of humna like a leaf of tree, killed by hanging, throwing life and dead human body down from the hilltops, massacred them, burned houses, and looted all what comes on his wild bipedal killer dogs, militias. Weigh the Oromos who resisted and stood firm against his fascistic acts. The survivors from his brute were forced to proselytizations in mass, renamed, or to flight. Through eviction, he further began to resettle his alien gun carriers, called the Naftaniya Safari, that turned to the recipe of all settler tyrant, who catapulted to the political power and followed his footsteps. They all instigated and waged relentless wars toward the south to Habeshas proper. War and resettlement of the aliens of the north on occupied territory that has exponentially increased from one to the next generations turned their art of life, and that holds true to the very date. Another 𝗂𝗂, renamed to Yohannes IV of Tigray, ruled from 1872 to 1889, following the footstep of Tewodros and finally Saul Miriam, renamed to the Mythikak, Menelik. The second II, 1889-1913, who was left to the only beneficiary of all European colonizers while both castes were killed. As a result, Menelik was turned to the established of the empire, as she has been known as the prison house, where over 80 ethno-nations have been incarcerated. He established a predatory prey relationships between the primitive Habeshas settlers, as they prefer to call themselves, or the European equable term Abyssinia, Amhara, and Tigray mainly, as she has been known on the paper now. The departing points and the major goals of all empires known in human history were basically territorial acquisition and exploitation of natural and human resources of the terra they occupied and the colonies they established through violence, waged cataclysmic wars in one hand and their ideological jingoism. Civilization missioners, superior in this and in that, elected race to rule, etc. On the other hand and feature of the nature of the Habeshas and the empire she established could not be otherwise. The ideological jingoism has been used as a dangerous tool, a silent, killer targeted to wiping out and assimilate the survivors of their colonies, to justify it as terra nullius, for eternal exploitation of rich resources and cheap labors to develop their mother countries. But empires are not merely empires, if one not only sees the overcover, or the coat, but dig deep inside to the root. There are two forms of the establishments of known empires: the overseas oceans or outer empires and the inland or internal empires. Overseas or outer European empires do differ with inland or internal colonization. In premise they moved, and in their ultimate goals. For instance, the British Empire, what was called the United Kingdom by itself, come out as a result of long-lasting inland or internal colonization, of the conquest of the people of Wales, Ireland, and eventuality Scotland. The establishments of overseas colonies by the British began by occupying North America in the last quarter of the 16th century that stretched to all inhabitable continents, till its death and dismantled, decolonized and liberated free states were reborn in the last quarter of the 20th century. Most of empires known in history owe, homegrown civilizations, systems, regularly trained and state-paid armies, navies, etc., and produce their own firearms, finances, have public schools, colleges, and universities, etc. But the settler-colonial empire of Abyssinian is unique in its all forms. She was obligate, dependent, predatory settler-colonial empire, invented, enabled by European colonizers of Africa. See more the anomaly of the scramble for Africa of 884. Coming out of a century of barbarism, butchering each other, the primitive and barbaric nomadic warlords who owed no houses to live in, beg for bread, let alone to have a regular army and navy or finance, etc. Thanks to the resources, greedy European colonizers and genociders unreserved supports with all necessary tools, firearms, training to kill, in competing to boost up their sphere of influence on the 𝗘𝗁𝗵𝗂𝗃 warlords that shifted the paradigm, and gave an opportunity to wage wars of eliminations conquered, occupied and resettled with Habesha colonies that turned her the burden and the prison house of the whole South to the very date the Abyssinia or Habesha Empire. The artificial bone known, yet as 𝗏𝗏s, Ethiopia state on paper. The 𝗏𝗏𝗁𝗏s, settler colonials, or safaris moved with premise of wiping out, uprooting the indigenousness as a whole by weapons and training provided by Europeans who waged relentless wars in an attempt to usurp indigenous lands. Uproot socio-political, economic, cultural, spiritual matrix, native knowledges, world view, absolutely prohibited practices of their own homegrown, developed values, norms and taboos of their inherited ancestral social fabrics, in all spheres of their life in daylight. When one speaks of Abyssinia, it is a must to keep in mind, as a rule of thumb and deploy it, what pioneer sacred experts, who devoted their academic life, wrote books taught us who finally ferret out what exactly was the essential feature of the nature of the Habesha or Abyssinia Empire that was established in the last quarter of the 19th century in the image of the European colonizers. Sacred scholars found out that the settler Abyssinian Empire codified her with many self-explanatory terms, such as a pawn of European colonizers, a right-hand extensions of Western colonization, a burden of white people, a burden of black people, etc. To put it all in one, she was dependent and still is on foreigners for here establishments, maintenance and survival in one hand, and preying on the whole South that makes 5 to 6 times larger. Prosperous as to Abyssinia proper on the other hand. These facts hold true since her establishments to the current that we did not get rid of her yet. What was unique in Amharic, settlers' colonial language when compared to other colonial languages of the Europeans in Africa, was that Menelik himself and his loyal servants, underdogs, were illiterate in their own pidgin alphabet and language. None can read and write, let alone to teach or transmit to the territory under occupations. In general, the 𝗏𝗏𝗁𝗏s were a collection of illiterate, arrogant, barbaric, primitive bipeds, wandering nomads who carried guns provided by Europeans, know nothing except killing, looting, and eating raw, and subhuman acts like a wild beast that holds true to the very hour. In folk's word, they were signified as bipedal plagues, barbaric human-like creatures who do not let the grass grow under their feet, but a tree, what a tree, an eccidental eucalyptus. As a result, the empire turned to the prison house of nations, gruesomely incarcerated within her artificial demarcation and bonding, as she manifests on paper yet. Thus the language of settlers stayed and stays the language of the settlers spoken only in settled military garrisons, let alone to talk about education, meant schools, where there was no institutions of any sort, but banditry or gaffal system, predatory prey life, throughout. As a rule of thumb, if one departs from what meant history, and history is a science, and must be a science it is interrogative and investigative, then there is no an inch of turf named Ethiopia of Greek roots even worst that speak an Amharic language, before it was even born late alone a nation. Indeed, it is nothing but a collection of strange, myth, legends, fairy tales, myths and imported lies sold without shame, and they are successful with it to the very date. The whole imported ideological, theological, etc. jingoism, self-aggrandizement, Uniqueness, etc. collection junks that holds no grain of truth can packed all in one and throw it in garbage without regrets and hesitation. One loses nothing but headache, migraine, stomachache, etc., and set his precious mind free, liberated and control his own mind. I have no doubt in share in you my own long journey of mental decolonization, which is simple to write and read, but very challenging to practice analog to addiction and habits. I have no doubt in the mind of lie traders my fact-based conclusion. The truth will turn into a piece of bone, stacked in their throat that neither swallowed nor coughed out. More important for 𝗏𝗏𝗁𝗏s, their offspring, reproduced in Oromia and their assimilate phonies or else, where who operates under the mask of one Ethiopia by equating the Euro-dependent predatory settler-colonial empire in the Northeast Africa, the burden of the downtrodden masses incarcerated with this prison house ruled by guns sign her invention to the present. For more 𝗏𝗏𝗁𝗏. The 𝗏𝗏𝗁𝗏s within 𝗪𝗏𝗴𝗏, putting knife on your throats. Even more ludicrous is when one come across that designated the settler language as lingua franca, and comes across figured fake statistics of their language to make it more palatable for those who did not really know who the Habeshas are, the blasted liars who took it through their maternal colostrum, as the Oromos says. First, there was no constitution of any sort in the barbaric empire since her establishment at the last quarter of the 19th century, let alone to talk about Amharica's national language. An infection that begins and as a communication vehicle and infrastructure to transfect their language to bored mass of the populations, which the pitch-black monster Menelik and his followers claimed the empire they rule. The first constitution in written form was the plagiarized document of Emperor Meiji of Japan Empire on face value, translated into Amharic, a Creole settler language by 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 dated 16th July, 1931, who attests to himself without a shame, the conqueror of the Lion of Judah and the King of King elected by God. He is a self-denier whom we did not know his biological father indeed, while we know Mekonnen and his mother was known to have 8 dead-born children and cannot bear child. If you have a doubt, look, his photo carefully his hawk or eagle-like nose and fan ears and 𝗏𝗏𝗏 with his father called Mekunen. Thus it is a license, not a genealogy for self-deniers. He was also a treason who fled to Britain on Saturday, May 2, 1936, 3 days before the Italians occupied Finfani to save his neck. 5 years later, Britain brought him back to Finfani in the wake of Allied victory of the Second World War, who kicked out Italia in 1941 and put him on the throne after 5 years in exile. Teffer Mekonnen followed the footsteps of his predecessors, used Amharic as his official language, deployed and employed as a major tool of segregation, repression, assimilation, exploitation, balkanization of the whole South and scrambling like a pieces of cakes to his loyal warlords and the establishment's feudal slave relationships with his empire. He imposed it by subjugating cursing, deviling the language and the culture of the whole South that was and still diametrically antagonistic in its all form and values by nature. The gulf between the Creole language, based on third-hand imported Zionist myth embedded in the culture, and the 𝗏𝗏𝗏 system, predatory prey system of Habeshas proper, was brought and injected by the Abyssinian settler colonialist. All settler colonialists, the 𝗏𝗏𝗁𝗏s, exploited the differences for their benefits, and as means of assimilation that suit the settler colonialists' dream as a standards of absolute fact, and executed by all means they can. They relentlessly used the myth as a license to beg the foreigners for all sorts of helps, where firearms and finance ranks in first line to maintain their myth and its status quo as she is known yet, and to justify the crimes they committed throughout the interactions of the Abyssinian tyrants. Their settlers' killer dogs, militias, gruesome of subhuman acts like wild beast against the whole people of the South. If one move out of Finfani within Oromia, as a whole one hears it rarely, and indeed no one needed it at all, after all it comes to serve, to exploit their resources, and to denigrate, subjugate, and to erase their identity. Our heroes and heroines saved Afan Oromo alive from one to the next generation in charge. Our heroes and heroines knew from the very beginning and the coming of the settlers not only as a physical burden, even worse to erase their language, culture, history, 𝗰𝗴𝗄𝗃, 𝗬𝗏𝗻𝗄, as a whole under the hidden curricula clad under the garb of civilization torch. Although very few 𝗰𝗄𝗄s went through the curricula of Amharization, the settlers' transfection, that means injection of the foreign product, Amharic language in the 𝗰𝗄 mind, to the whole system of assimilation, with its all ingredients, culture, history, civilizations, wordview, etc., into the mind of the colonized. Here began the experiment and the efficiency or the success of the experimental bipedal human. The main goal of the experiment is to inject the new product so that the assimilate goes through mental suicides from within himself as a result of erasing his identity and supplanting the new through the process of brain draining and permanent transformations to be a good new product at the end. The perfect assimilate is baptized, a palace reserved from him in heaven, renamed and prepared to go to hell on earth and ready to fight until his last birth. And that is the alpha and the omega of the promised goal of the colonizer assimilations program. The assimilates out of Habeshas curricula, and the convertant's deadly believes that she is more civilized, knowers, modern, patriot, pompous nomming and titles without limit usurper, a betrayal, the worst beast from within his own people. In case of 𝗰𝗄 assimilates a 𝗕𝗏, the language of the 𝗰𝗄 people, that of their own ancestors for whom generations scarified their life and kept it alive and inherited, is totally erased or buried deep in the dark that led her to self-rejection. As a result, she turned to the perfect assimilate ready to give her neck to his master as eater lamb. A bad child bits his mother nipples. The paradox of assimilates in 𝗰𝗄 case is unique. While most parents proudly rejected the Amharization means assimilation by all means they can, and told encourage in 𝗰𝗄 language when translated literally, it means, even if you cut my ear, I can or will not want to listen to your 𝗪𝗲𝗄𝗃 pigeon language. The metaphoric expression of even if you cut my ears means, indeed, even if my ear is deafened or my ears turned deaf. A resolute expression, proudness that indeed proves a sign of total rejections of the settler, pigeon Amharic language whose goal is to erase 𝗰𝗄𝗃, and nothing more or less. Indeed, it committed cultural genocide, attempted to supplant by itself, by erasing from the mind and the memory of the 𝗰𝗄 people and they targeted, and to produce a perfect assimilate to the extent it can. It indeed produced some perfect assimilates, remodeled them to extent that infection deeply reached the point to believe that he or she is civilized, modern, knower, as his or her own folk in imitating. Quoting his master's word, the perfect assimilate internal suicide that turns to begin incursing and deviling a 𝗕𝗏, his own mother tongue. The 𝗰𝗄s often express the first tongue as a 𝗕𝗏𝗊𝗵 𝗪 ™ that means the language of my father and my mother in more precisely fashion. The intelligence of settler brain drainers is that the assimilate is awarded for his, her endeavor unique names such as our hero, our Messiah, our patriot, who come to save our beloved one and the only one country, the paragon of all civilizations, etc. So far, she is a loyal servant of his master. These words ignites the adrenaline level high and boosts his preparedness to sacrifice his life for it. Once he was gone, he will be erased from the history or remembered in one sentence in a way that suit the system. Our beloved 𝗟𝗵𝗽𝗃 has left us. God bless his soul in heaven. He 𝗪𝗴𝗃 in hell on earth. Settler colonialism indeed creates the pseudo-patriotism of the colonized in various levels, from bottom to the tip of the pyramid of his assimilates from within the establishments. She who turned his back to his people and has no pardon. He imposes the very language that cursed, deviled, and constitutionally arrested his own language as irrelevant attempts to discard it, and impose his master's language as he was trained as prime, civilized, patriotic, unique, etc., and consider it as his national language. In case of 𝗰𝗄s, physically, such as the assimilate nominal 𝗰𝗄 collaborator, such as 𝗔𝗯𝘆𝗀𝗶𝗰, from and within the 𝗰𝗄, who served his master Saul Miriam, or Menelik II, He was a loyal servant fo our life long once his masters were satisfied with his duties finally killed like a rat by poisoning. Other, alikes who followed 𝗔𝗵𝗵𝗿's footsteps who served a series of Abyssinian ruling shiftas throughout her survival and maintains of her status quo of the empire intact to the very date at the end, were also killed like a rabid dog by bullet, or hanged like a boot of wildcats. Virtually 𝗪𝗡𝗎𝗄s and their assimilates do not know what shame and disgrace are so far their stomach that controls their brain is fully packed. In folk's word, they were designated as bipedal plagues, barbaric human-like creatures collections of illiterate, arrogant barbaric primitive bipeds wandering nomads who carried guns who do not let the grass grow under their feet. But a tree, what a tree, a eucalyptus. They know nothing except killing, looting, and eating raw, and subhuman acts like a wild beast that holds true to the present. Afan Oromo, Oromo language, is the alpha and the omega of the Oromo nation, for whom the heroes and heroines scarified and sacrifices their life, since the day of colonization and occupations of their ancestral soil, to the very minute against the aliens of the northern settlers, the 𝗪𝗡𝗎𝗄s. These are series of gangs who committed genocides, slave entrepreneurs, looters and devil monstrous, and the offsprings of divers invader. By nature they are backward, barbarian, lazy horses who know nothing except killing, rapes, looting and preying on the resources and the labors of the whole South. We must question who is making a decision on whom, whose socio-political, economic, political, and ideological dominancy is selected to be safeguarded. Where, how, and why do the offspring of divers invaders of the settler yet dream, vocal, pompous, arrogant, and plead to bring back their monsters from their graveyard and the backward, hand-capped pigeon language called Amharic, the language of genociders and ethnociders in the region? Once we know that, there will be no seconds, minutes to lose to backfight with all tools necessary on our terra, in our home, on ancestral soil, and on our own language's status, unless we are neurotic or even more schizophrenic, when the offsprings the 𝗪𝗡𝗎𝗄s dances in front of our noses in symphony, the placenta land the scent of 𝗔𝗵𝗵𝗿𝗀. The center of General Assembly and the capital city of Oromia, where the wound of the genocide, ethnocides, evictions, displacements and incarcerations of the Oromo people for 1¼ centuries turned to be the major duties and accomplishments the Habeshas brigands to the very date is yet open, laid alone to give them a credit for one, the backward, narrow chauvinist. Settler language that was indeed scientifically disqualified by all native languages, and hurdle for the development and global technological civilizations, that we must get rid of it by all means necessary at prompt. It is important settlers by virtue could never show their dark sides. They are like a moon that enforces us to unveil that other to the public in concern, and to the larger global community either of the past or the present. If at all one thinks to live as good neighbors, let alone to live within each other. Fact is all tyrants who ruled the barbaric empire since here establishment are crowned as their heroes by the settler colonists, the 𝗪𝗡𝗎𝗄s and their offspring. Yet, for the Oromos and their historical alikes, i.e., the entire people of the South to Habeshas proper, incarcerated within this prison house that preyed on them. All Habeshas warlords packed in one are genociders and ethnociders without exceptions where the wounds and are yet open. The damages are irreversible. We do not even begin to talk the macabre level of crimes they all committed. One must not forget that 𝗪𝗡𝗎𝗄s by virtue owe a trait of megalomania, and they do yet dream to bring their monstrous from their graveyard to safeguard the prison house as they roar like a bull packed of lies, arrogance, hypocrisy, and denials in every corner today in 21st century, without thinking about the unforeseen and insurmountable consequences. Far from being a neutral medium, the Amharic language, particularly in its historical role under the 𝗪𝗡𝗎𝗄 system, has been powerfully framed by some as a settler-colonial Creole, a linguistic tool forged through conquest and deployed for domination. This perspective argues that its widespread imposition across various newly integrated territories of the Abyssinia Empire was not merely an organic process, but a deliberate instrument for consolidating power, enforcing assimilation, and systematically dismantling the rich linguistic diversity of indigenous peoples. Its ascendance, often enforced through policies that marginalized or banned local tongues in administration, education, and public life, has led to the erosion and, in many cases, the threatened extinction of countless African languages, estimates reaching upwards of 100. To characterize this historical dynamic as simply fostering bilingualism is to fundamentally misunderstand and downplay the coercive nature of its spread, which aligns less with benign linguistic addition and more with a deliberate ethnocides, a cultural erasure achieved through linguistic domination rather than mutual enrichment. It all begins with language, and there is no ifs, ands, or buts on Oromo language, Afan Oromo, Oromo land, Biya Oromo, the culture and identity, Adafai Oromuama. They are all inviolable. That is all about what liberation of 𝗪𝗴𝗡 means. The grass never grow under the feet of the settler-colonialists, the 𝗪𝗲𝘃𝗃, but a tree. What a tree, an ecocidal eucalyptus tree symbol of 𝗪𝗲𝘃𝗃 system. I thank you for your time to listen in my little contribution and share. Subscribe and comment. 𝗪𝗲𝘃𝗃𝗃. Can Hankate Wakni Iti Yagudu.